Hello, hello, hello. I hope you all are having a fantastic Tuesday, and I hope you've all enjoyed the surprise I posted on Monday. Let's get started. Chapter 10: The Key to Memory. Derek lay on the hard, narrow bed and wondered what Woolruff and Mandelbrot were doing. Probably still sitting out around Kappa Whale and the Star Seeker, waiting. Of course they could not readily get star charts without a human to front for them, though Mandelbrot might try. It would not be unusual for a robot to open communications. But if the other ship insisted on speaking to the owner-captain, Star Seekers were small ships, he couldn't very well be far from the controls. For that matter, Derek was uncertain how well Mandelbrot could lie under such circumstances. Well, there was nothing he could do for them. He couldn't leave Earth, and if he could, he couldn't leave Ariel here. Ariel was now raving in delirium in the Section Hospital in Webster Grove sector, city of St. Louis. A long way, he gathered, from the nearest spaceport, near New York. Derek wished for a drink. He wished for a light snack, cookies at least, and fresh hot coffee, even synthetic coffee. In the next room was a robot, ready to spring into action at his slightest word. Almost. It was an earthly robot, in an earthly city. Derek could send our David out, but there was no assurance it would return, and it would not be with food, for Derek didn't rate meals in his own apartment. Damn Dr. Avery for not arranging for higher ratings. But that would have been more conspicuous, he supposed. Light from the door shone across the bread. "Time to rise, Mr. Avery," said our David. "Yes, thank you, our David." Derek groaned slightly and sat up to sit for a moment with his elbows on his knees, chin in hands. In the short life that he could remember, it had been one crisis after another. "All I want," he decided, "is peace and quiet. A little establishment on some mountain brook in the boondocks of Aurora, or Nexon maybe, with just a couple of robots in a landing field only big enough for my own machine and one other. Maybe the Solarians had the right idea. They never saw anybody and lived totally surrounded by robots. No, he decided, that wasn't such a good idea after all. Earth turned inside out, he thought vaguely, no better than— "Dr. Avery, are you well?" "Yes, our David, merely depressed. I'm worried about Ariel." That the robot could understand. "Yes, Mr. Avery, I also worry about her. But the doctors report her condition good, do they not?" "Yes, they did last night, our David. What she's like today—" He left it, sombre, dressed carelessly, and tucked some equipment into the little bath satchel he had bought the day before. Admonishing our David rather hollowly not to worry, he set off for the personal, returned to drop off the satchel when he had showered and washed his extra clothing, and departed for the section kitchen. This part of the trip was so routine now that he neither saw nor was seen by the policemen in the corridors and junctions. He no longer stood out like a stranger. Breakfast was, as usual, good, but to him tasteless. Listlessly Derek ate it, not even interested in a fact he had finally deduced. It was neither synthetic nor natural, but both. It was made of living things and was therefore natural, but was made by an artificial process and was therefore synthetic. The basis of 3/4 of it was yeast. He suspected that there might be a steady, if small, market for earthly food yeast in the space worlds, if spacers could overcome their sense of superiority long enough to try it. Granted, spacer high cuisine had no equal on Earth that Derek had tasted, but spacer ships were usually furnished with synthesizers. So much for spacer cuisine, he thought. The hospital was a familiar place to him now. Derek did not trouble with the waiting rooms, but went to the Friends Lounge and queried Ariel's condition on the monitor. There had been a problem when they had discovered that she wasn't in the system. Derek had professed ignorance of the ID tag, and it was assumed, he hoped, that it had been lost when they all crowded around to help Ariel during her collapse. Naturally he didn't remember her number, and in their honest ignorance she and he had left the other ID forms behind. Derek had promised to supply them with it next day, but so far had forgotten to do so the one time they remembered to ask him for it. They had to input her with a dummy ID. Ariel was in a room of 2 robots. Here in intensive care, people were either unconscious or so debilitated by their illness they didn't care that it was robots who waited on them. She was not raving today. At first Derek thought she was asleep, she lay so quietly. But then she moved, and a robot sprang forward to smooth the pillow behind her. She looked at it vacantly, closed her eyes. A faint sound behind him was Dr. Lee. The woman shook her head sadly. "How is she, doctor?" Derek asked. "As far as the disease goes, the worst is over. She will live, but what you're seeing now may be worse. She is gradually losing her memories." Derek had had some of this explained to him. "I suppose she's in a half-hallucinatory state now." "Yes, or something like an intense daydream. Perhaps a brown study would be a better analogy. One of those almost hypnotic states of concentration in which you don't see what's in front of you." Derek had a vague flash memory of someone waving a hand in front of his nose, and nodded. Ariel was reliving her life as drowning people are popularly supposed to do. "It wouldn't take me long," he mused. "I suppose I might have time for it. But Ariel. Could I visit her?" Dr. Lee frowned, looking sadder. "You could, but after today it'll get worse." She hesitated. "There's always a shock for the loved ones, when the patient doesn't recognize them. That will happen, you know." Derek hadn't thought of that, and the mere thought shocked him. "Then can I visit her today?" "I'll ask." Ariel looked at him blankly, but it wasn't a lack of recognition. It was more a lack of energy. "Oh, Derek, how are you?" What do you say to someone who may be alive tomorrow but won't remember you? If Derek's memories had been 100 years long rather than a couple of months he still wouldn't have had anything to guide him. "Well enough," he said awkwardly. He drew near the bed, touched it. She looked at him without much emotion. "Are you going to help them restore my memory?" "Of course, I'll have to. And I hope you have been talking?" He indicated the robots with a tilt of his head. "A little," she said reluctantly. "I'm so tired all the time, and they keep me so full of drugs. I don't have the spirit. Besides, it doesn't matter. It won't help. It won't really be me, Derek. It's like dying. It's like dying. I won't see you again. I won't see anyone again. It's all fading." One of the robots sprang to the head of the bed and did something, and Ariel's eyes closed. When they opened after a moment, the horror had largely passed. Derek thought it was still there, though, masked by the drug. "That isn't so, Ariel," he insisted. "Your memories are still there, in your brain. They merely need to be unlocked. Well—" She was shaking her head. "No, it's all going. I'm dying, Derek. Whoever takes my place will be someone different." Abruptly he said, "Am I different than the man I was?" "Of course, and yet you're him." She closed her eyes and tears trembled on her eyelids. The dark robot got busy at the headboard again. "Derek, I want you to know that I've always loved you. Even when I was most angry, even when I was most frightened, I never blamed you. For weeks I've watched, hoping you would never develop the final form of the disease. I guess you did, or you wouldn't have lost your memory. Whoever cured you didn't have the technology to restore your memory." She drifted off into sleep, and after a moment Derek choked down his impulse to cry out, to demand that they awaken her. Suddenly his lost memory seemed less important than what she knew, seemed less important than what she thought of him. "Farewell, Ariel," he managed to say huskily, and stumbled out into the Friends' Lounge, where he sat and wept for a time, quietly. He wondered vaguely if, in all his unremembered life, he had felt this sharp, poignant pain, and doubted it. Yet he had known her another life, and it had not been a wholly happy relationship. He had had an mnemonic plague. The emptiness in his head was proof enough for him. Had he gotten it from her, or given it to her? Presently he took a deep breath, let it out in a sigh that came from the bottom of his belly, and wiped his face on a tissue from the dispenser. Robots were probably watching him. Within minutes Dr. Lee and a worried-looking Dr. Powell entered the room. They sat and looked him over while he braced himself. Fortunately, they, like he, had more important things on their minds than Ariel's ID tags. I understand that Korolenko has told you a little about memory restoration, Dr. Powell said. Derek remembered an exchange from an earlier visit. He nodded. Memory traces are not memory. Yes. Quite so. A memory traces the synapse, the nerve connection in the brain, that leads to the memory, which is stored in chemical form. It is these synapses that are being erased by the neurotoxin of the plague. The actual memories remain untouched. They looked at him. If only you knew how much I know about this, he thought. Right, he said, but since their addresses are unknown, to put it in computer jargon, the memories are as lost as if the records had been wiped. Almost, said Dr. Lee. There are ghost memories flitting about the patient's mind, and many little things will jolt a few of the memories loose. Smell is one of the subtlest and most powerful memory keys, said Dr. Powell, nodding. Derek knew. Yes. So, in what we loosely call a memory restoration, we merely supply new synapses as nearly identical to the old as possible. And in the functioning of the new memory traces, Derek said, parroting what he'd been told, the patient reactivates the old chemical memories. Quite so. The more accurate and detailed the new memory traces are, the more complete, not only the restoration of the memories, but the restoration of the patient's original personality. I hope you can see that. It was an angle that had never occurred to him. He supposed that he had the same basic personality as ever, pragmatic, problem-solving, not given to abstract thought, not artistic or poetic. An equable temperament, the engineering mind. Now that he thought of it, though, perhaps his personality was different. He had known Ariel in his former life. He must have had strong feelings about her. He did again. Not still, again. For if he had not met her since his memory loss, and had not continuously been practically in solitary confinement with her, he might well not have felt that way about her again. His parents, for instance, he no longer felt about them as he once must have done. His friends, all those parts of his personality were gone. If he acquired new friends, his emotional response would be much the same, of course. His personality had not changed in any basic way, or so he supposed. He did not seem very strange to Ariel. Still, he was a new and different person from the old Derek, whatever his name had been. Perhaps Ariel was right. Perhaps it was a form of death. Yet, if the memory traces are close enough to the original, ideally it would be like copying a program into a blank post-traumatic brain, said Dr. Lee. The second robot would, for all practical purposes, become the old one. You always explain what's been done to them, Derek said absently. Yes, but if the original was destroyed, Derek frowned, the new one would, for all intents and purposes, be the same one in a new body. True, it was not unlike shifting a post-traumatic brain to a new robotic body. Derek had an uneasy flash. In Robot City there had been an accidental death of a boy called David, which Ariel and Derek had investigated for the robots. This David had looked just like him. He usually shrugged that fact off, but now he was jolted. Maybe the other one was the duplicate, or was it himself? In a human, of course, it's not so simple, said Dr. Powell, not noticing his jolted expression. We could activate a significant fraction of the locked memories without reactivating the old personality. It's a matter of knowing which memories are important to the patient. How close can we come? Derek asked. It depends on how much we know. The robots are, of course, recording and analyzing everything she says, and there's a tendency to relive the most important memories first and most often, till they're gone. So we're developing a good sketch, too crude to be called a diagram. Derek nodded. That's where you need my help. Quite so. You know better than we, or the robots, can hope to. Not well enough, I'm afraid, said Derek steadily, wishing for some of that tranquilizer they were keeping Ariel on. I've only known her for a few weeks. And already married? Their expression said. Spacer morals. Derek didn't enlighten them. I can go into a lot of detail about our time together, but before that, she was a very private person. Again, their expression spoke for them. Spacers lived alone, on the surface, surrounded only by robots, and had few human contacts. Not true, but try to explain. Besides, he had his own quote of chauvinistic nonsense about Earth there is to lose. Whatever you can do, you must do, said Dr. Lee said heavily. Oh, well, I can't, Derek said lamely. If he mentioned his amnesia, they'd be all over him. The question of their identities would rise in a way he couldn't duck. The Terrys would certainly be called in, and the space embassy at the port would be queried. The whole house of cards would come down. Next thing you know, they would have learned about Dr. Avery and Robot City. That secret must be kept at all costs. "Why not?" Dr. Powell barked. "It's a matter of privacy, sir." "Oh," greatly mollified. "Spacers! Well, there's a lot more that you can do sitting here. Why don't you take all the material we have with you? Go home and do your dictating there." Derek had been so used to having first law driven robots intruding on his life that he was startled by this easy acquiescence. A robot wouldn't let anything be put into Ariel's head without checking it over first. "And the memory traces? Will they be kept private?" The doctors looked at each other. "Well, they have to be coded," Dr. Lee began. Dr. Powell said, "They use a technique modified from one used to implant synapses in postronic brains. Of course, that can't be used on human brains, but it's based on the same idea, as it were. I don't know the full details myself." "But it's a matter of coding," said Dr. Lee. "We're having a specialist come in from the Mayo. If he could teach you, perhaps you could code the more private portions?" It took several conversations and a conference before it was decided to let Derek attempt coding memory traces for Ariel. His education stood him in good stead. He had the necessary background to do the work. Spacer! The expressions again, this time with approval. Spacer education in robotics and computers in general was notoriously the best. The work called for the use of a good computer, and with some trepidation he revealed the existence of our David during the conference. "Of course," Dr. Powell said, "a spacer would naturally have a robot in his apartment." They seemed to take it quite for granted, and be a little amused by it. "Scott's sleeping with bagpipes," someone muttered at the back of the room, a reference that sounded so funny that Derek meant to look it up, but forgot. He didn't think of it again until weeks later, far too late to ask. So once again he was instructed in the technique, not simple but not too hard to learn, of coding memories as synapses. Derek sat up day and night, dictating his memories of his life with Ariel. "Any time she remembers something, play the memory trace. There's a certain strong chance that you will unlock the actual memory of the event, or of part of it," the expert told Derek. "Each such unlocked memory will be retained, and will strengthen the memory trace leading to it, and to the fields about it. All this was worked out at the Laney within the past 10 years. She was a sharp-nosed, unpretty woman, tiny and quite dark of skin. The breeds of man, or races as they were called on Earth, remain far more distinct than on the spacer worlds. Darla, her name was, and she knew her stuff. She seemed to be hundreds of years old. He supposed vaguely that she might be 60 or 70. Eventually, the personality that is recovered will be indistinguishable from the patient's original personality, both to the patient and the patient's loved ones. But that depends on the accuracy of the memories, the accuracy of the coding, and the completeness of the memories. The coding accuracy he could create by care and sheer hard work. The completeness of the memories he had little control over. At least, he thought comfortingly, the last weeks of her life must be very important, and those he could cover well. But the accuracy of the memories? How did he know what was important to her and what was not? Her moods had always been a mystery to him. He could do his best, and try not to worry too much. Derek took to visiting the hospital every other day, and sometimes every third day. Whether he went or not, he always stopped at the public comb booth mornings and evenings, on the way to and from the kitchen, to call and ask about her. The news usually was that she was doing well, but was in no condition to talk. Derek knew it. His work went rapidly enough, but there was a lot of it. He slogged through it grimly. If not for the necessity of going out to call the hospital, he might not have gone near the kitchen until our David was forced to take action to prevent collapse. He had one slight consolation. His own memories must also be locked away, unharmed by the plague. If only he could find someone who knew him as well as Ariel did before she lost her memories, someone he could persuade to come to Earth and dictate his memories. Not likely, knowing spacers, but there was that thread of hope that he might recover his memories, might recover himself. Nights were bad. He dreamed nightmares of Ariel not responding to the treatment and being as blank as he had been upon waking. It was terribly important that she not lose her memories of him. And in the dream it was always his fault. His coding failed, or she was swept away in the flash flood through the drains of Robot City, or Robot City! It, too, haunted his dreams, and these dreams were even darker and more frightening than the nightmares about Ariel's. Those he could understand. They sprang from a quite natural anxiety. But the Robot City dreams were different. They didn't even seem like dreams. They seemed frighteningly real. In the mornings Derek's hands shook, and he hoped the doctors never started asking serious questions. They'd know for sure he was crazy. He was dreaming that Robot City was inside him. He dreamt of gleaming buildings rising on the lobes of his liver, great dark red planes stacked above each other or on his ribs or inside his lungs, the buildings expanding and contracting as he breathed. Then the dream seemed to become much clearer, and he knew, in the crazy dream way, that Robot City was in his bloodstream. Enclosed buildings, like space cities on lonely rocks, he thought. Yeah, but jeering didn't drive off the frightened, helpless feeling, the feeling of being invaded and used. I suppose that's the source of this dream, he thought, trying to comfort himself. I've been moved and manipulated from the beginning. The next time he walked into the Friends' Lounge, Korolenko brought him Dr. Lee and an unsmiling, athletic young man with the look of eagles in his eyes. "Yes?" Derek said to the stranger. "This is Special Agent Donovan," said Dr. Lee, frowning slightly, "of the Terrestrial Bureau of Investigation." And thus ends this chapter. I hope you enjoy. Bye!